Who exactly was the lost generation? Why were they considered lost? And where are they today? Well, they're literally all deceased, so at least we know where they are now. That's just no good. My name is Corey Bradford. You may know me as This Is Corey from my history skits on TikTok, and I'm starting a new series where I'm going to talk at length about different generational cohorts. So generational cohorts are basically these categories we use to group people together based on when they were born and the events that occurred during their young lives. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the lost generation. Now, I want to start by saying that these generational cohorts are going to be based on descriptions from the Western world. So the way these generations align in other parts of the world may be slightly different. This is also mostly going to be based on descriptions from the United States. However, with the lost generation in particular, a lot of this does overlap with experiences in Europe, primarily in England and France. Also, none of these start and end dates for these generations are set in stone. So if you disagree with the starting or end dates, please let me know in the comments and describe how you would group the generations differently. So let's get into the lost generation. Generally speaking, they are a generation of people born between the years 1883 and 1900. This generation is also known as the generation of 1914. That's the year World War I broke out, and World War I is going to be one of the defining events that shapes the young lives of the lost generation. This generation came of age during World War I, and most of the young soldiers who perished in that war were from this generation. This generation is also largely associated with the decadence of the so-called Roaring '20s. So when you think of flappers, Prohibition-era speakeasies, and the Charleston, you're thinking of the lost generation. Now, why do we call the lost generation the lost generation? What do we mean by them being lost? This actually refers to a couple of things. The term lost generation was actually coined by writer Gertrude Stein. Stein was a little bit older than the average lost generation member, being born in the 1870s, but of course she was a thought leader for this generation, known for being an expatriate who left the United States and went to Paris, where she started running a salon in which many of the lost generation's best writers and artists gathered. These figures include writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and painters like Pablo Picasso. The term basically meant that individuals from this generation were sort of lost after World War I. There was a major existential crisis among the survivors of that war, in which many of them questioned the very purpose of life itself. Many of them wandered the earth aimlessly. They moved to other countries. They were essentially lost. In Europe, the term actually refers to the millions of young men who were physically lost to World War I. Not since the age of Napoleon had a young generation experienced such an enormous loss of human life in such a short period of time. The term lost generation may also refer to how older generations viewed the lost generation, particularly in the 1920s, due to the debauchery of the Roaring '20s. When older adults heard the tales of raunchy exploits from the New York nightlife scene, they probably thought, wow, those young people have really lost their way, which is how all older generations see all young people. It never ends. So what was it like growing up as a member of the lost generation? Despite the fact that this generation would come to be associated with the wild times of the Roaring '20s, most members of the lost generation grew up extremely conservative, socially speaking, and a lot of traditional approaches to family and relationships were still in place throughout most of their lives. They are, interestingly enough, one of the first generations that as children started seeing restrictions to child labor. If you were born in, say, the mid-1890s or onward, then you actually saw laws put in place that prevented you from having to work in a coal mine or some factory at the age of 8, which was fairly common prior to those laws. So it can be argued that the lost generation is one of the first generations to experience an actual childhood free from the burdens of working, the way pretty much all children would experience after this period going forward. In the 1890s, companies began mass producing toys in the United States. So the lost generation is actually one of the first generations that all played with similar toys. And you'd be surprised how a small thing like that can really create a lasting bond between people who grew up in the same era. Now, as the lost generation began entering their young adult years, one major change they saw was the rise in independent women. During the First World War, women began working jobs outside of the home that would normally have been worked by men because all the men were off fighting in the war. And although most of these women did go back to living traditional lifestyles after the war, Some of them didn't, and those women continued to live as independently as possible well into the 1920s and 30s. Another reason why you see so many independent women in the 1920s is because there was a literal shortage of men after World War I. So some of these women just decided to live unconventional lifestyles in which marriage, children, and a man simply weren't necessary. The lost generation is also one of the first generations to grow up with a high level of media saturation. Prior to their time period, the only real media one could consume would be a local newspaper, or if they had a fair amount of money and lived in a big city, maybe magazines. But by the first decade of the 20th century, they started to see newer forms of media such as the radio. Now, radio doesn't become extremely widespread until the 1920s, but radio will change life forever. People will be able to hear the voices of other human beings, giving them news and entertainment in real time. Devices like the radio, the phonograph, and greater use of telephones make the very sound of the human voice extremely important to the lost generation. They also saw the rise in other groundbreaking forms of media such as films and motion pictures. Movies become available to the mass public by the first decade of the 20th century. And of course, by the 1920s, you have the birth of Hollywood and the silent film era. They also saw a rise in the use of electricity, household appliances such as vacuums and washing machines, and of course, there was the popularization of both the automobile and aviation. I also want to talk about what it was like for Black Americans who were members of the lost generation, because I think that's something that gets lost a lot of times in these types of discussions. During the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Black Americans began engaging in something known as the Great Migration. We also refer to it as the First Great Migration because another one occurred right after World War II. At the turn of the century, the majority of Black Americans still lived in the Deep South, the former Confederacy, and they were still dealing with tons of racism, violence from white supremacists, lynchings, and extremely unfair laws that relegated them to a permanent underclass status. The Civil War had been over with for well over 30 years at this point, and enough was enough. So many Black families decided to leave the South and move to industrialized cities in the North and Midwest. By 1910, African Americans had begun flooding cities such as New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Philadelphia. Black Americans of the lost generation are also responsible for the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural movement that saw an explosion of artistic endeavors among African Americans living in Harlem, New York. It was personified by the writings of poets like Langston Hughes and novelists like Zora Neale Hurston. There was also a musical explosion that saw the rise of famous musicians such as Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, whose music would be popular for most of the rest of the 20th century. And of course, the development of jazz occurred during this era as well. In fact, some even refer to this era as the Jazz Era. So now let's talk about the lost generation as they got older. You know, the lost generation might be one of the saddest generations to ever live in American history, because we have to remember, this is the main generation that is going to live throughout both world wars. As they got older, many of them saw their sons be sent off to the battlefields during the outbreak of World War II, as many of them had been sent a little over 20 years earlier during World War I. So you have to imagine the sadness and the immense sorrow of anyone who had to experience both of these conflicts. In fact, many of the older members of the lost generation are actually some of the main leaders of World War II. The main man most responsible for World War II, Adolf Hitler, was born in 1889. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt was born in 1882. And most of the top generals of World War II were members of the lost generation. The lost generation begins to enter their retirement and elderly years as you get into the 1950s and 60s, but their life expectancy was slightly longer than generations that came before them. In fact, the oldest official member of the lost generation, the last person born in the year 1900 to pass away, was a Japanese woman who died in 2018. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more of my breakdowns of every generation between the lost generation all the way up to Generation Alpha, make sure to like this video and subscribe to this page for more content like this.